What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, we're going to be working on the Ford F-150. I picked this kit up for about $100 on Amazon. It's by Detroit Axle. Let's check it out. So in the kit, you're going to get some tie rod ends, lower ball joints, and then you're going to have your sway bar end links. So it looks like you're going to have both inner and outer tie rods. We'll go ahead and swap those out in the kit as well. And then what I was really looking for, which is really bad on our pickup, is going to be these upper control arms. And it looks like these ones are going to be serviceable, so that's a plus as well. Okay guys, so I got all the parts laid out. What we're going to do is just bench prep them. Each one is going to get some grease pumped into them. So I got the upper ball and upper and lower ball joints here. And I've gone ahead and taken my grease fitting and pumped some grease just to get some in there, so I know there's grease in each fitting and all the components are ready for install. Let's get to work. So the first thing I'm going to do is set up these wheel chocks. We're going to do both the rear wheels. Here's the driver's side and the passenger side. So the next thing I'm going to do is going to set up my jack underneath the frame suspension here, and I'm going to set up both of my jack stands like this. So Ford welded these brackets here to the frame, and it looks like it's pretty solid, so I'm just going to put my jack stands underneath those on both sides. So this is actually why we're going to be rebuilding the front end. You can see all of the wear on the one side inside of this tire. The upper ball joints are bad, so we're going to replace those. Okay, so under the Ford truck, it allows us to remove both the inner and upper tie rods. So we're going to be removing this linkage here to the steering knuckle. We have to disconnect there, the lower ball joint and the upper ball joint control arm. You're going to go ahead and repeat the same steps for the one side that we're going to do today over to the other side. Let's go ahead and start removing cotter pins. We're just going to go ahead and straighten these out, and then you can pull back using a set of dikes like that. Pretty simple. Remove the other cotter key and remove the nut. Lower ball joint, we'll do the same. And with your 15/16 wrench, we'll just go ahead and loosen up this nut. And for the last one, we're going to remove the upper ball joint, cotter key, and nut. Like that. And with the 7/8 sockets, go ahead and remove this nut. Okay, so now all the castellated nuts have been removed from each and every ball joint that we're going to replace today. We're going to go ahead and cut the zip tie or remove the connector that clips the ABS sensor cable to the upper control arm. And we're going to unplug the ABS sensor like this and set that aside. So to remove the outer tie rod from the steering knuckle, in my case, I didn't need a puller. I didn't need a puller at all. But if you needed a puller, you could use something like this. Hook onto here, and then run your nut all the way in like this. And the inside of the ball joint shaft will go into here, and then it'll push the ball joint up and off. So once you disconnect the ball joint, your steering knuckle will be free and ready to be removed. So for the inner tie rod, I'm just going to go ahead and set up my puller like this and break that one off. Okay, so that one busted free with the puller. And we'll go ahead and slip that one off. So right now I'm going to go take this into my garage, and we're just going to go ahead and take this apart and rebuild it. Okay guys, so the setup for this is pretty simple. We're just going to measure from the end of this piece of tubing here. We're going to measure from this end here to the center of the ball joint, and on this side from the center of the ball joint. And then we're going to remove these two ball joints, and we're going to put on our new ones, and then with that measurement that we're going to write down right now, we're going to match up and duplicate this setup. So another thing to pay attention to is that the threads are going to be different. One's going to be left-handed, one's going to be right-handed. Another thing that I'm going to do, match up the positioning of the tie rods. So this one's in a vertical up position, so I made a mark there. I'm going to put this one in a vertical up position, and I'm going to make my mark here. And so when I take this apart, I can put them back exactly the same distance apart, and making sure that they're in the same orientation. So you can see where this one's horizontal and this one sets vertical. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to put this in the vise, and I'm going to crack both of these jam nuts loose. I'm going to unthread them, and then I'm going to thread my new ones on. So in my case, the longer one is right-handed thread, and the shorter one is left-handed thread. Okay, so here I'm just going to lock these down with some crescent wrenches. And the final adjustments will be made at the shop when they do an alignment. So now this tie rod end links are ready for install. Okay, so now that all of our nuts and cotter pins have been removed, we're going to go ahead and work on the upper ball joint control arm first. So I'm going to take a ball joint puller like so, and it has these forks, and it's going to push this way. You can see on a lever. As I run this nut down, it's going to fork it out of there. So the idea is to set it in here like so, and we're going to hammer this spot here into the joint. So now that we're centered, I'm going to go ahead and run this nut down, and using a 9/16 wrench, I'm just going to go ahead and start tightening this up. And then it's going to pop loose just like that. So now the upper ball joint has been removed. We're going to go ahead and set that off to the side. And before I break that lower ball joint loose, I'm going to hang up the hub assembly to the old control arm. That way when the lower ball joint is broken free, this hub assembly doesn't crash and hit the ground. Okay, so now we have the upper ball joint removed. We're going to work on the lower ball joint. I'm going to install this puller here. All right, I'm going to take my 9/16 wrench, and we're going to go ahead and bust this one free. It might be helpful to put something underneath the hub assembly so when it does free fall, it doesn't hit the ground. Just like that. So now I'm going to take this whole hub assembly like so, and I'm going to set it on the lower control arm. I'm going to slide my little stool over, pick it up, and set the hub assembly on my stool. Okay, so before I remove these two bolts that hold up the upper control arm, I'm going to mark the location where the bolts are running across between these two frames, this frame and this frame. Now this bolt sits in a slotted frame, so there is some adjustment left and right, back and forth for these bolts. So we want to make sure when we go to put this upper control arm, we put it back as close as possible. I'm going to take my 21mm socket and my 13/16 wrench, and we're going to go ahead and loosen up this bolt and remove it. Here's one nut. Now you're going to have these locks on both sides where on the outside of the between frame. You're going to want to make sure that goes back, and you can see where I marked the position of the bolt. Another thing to consider when replacing these upper control arms is to replace the bolts as well. You can see there's a lot of wear here on this side and this side here. It's probably a good idea to go ahead and replace these bolts because there's going to be some play or slop in this upper control arm. So next time I get under here, I'll probably most likely replacing these bolts. You can go ahead and remove the upper control arm like so. So once the upper control arm has been removed from these two between frames, we're going to go down to the lower control arm and replace the lower ball joint. So to do that, we're first going to remove the snap ring that's retaining the ball joint like so. So now that we have removed the snap ring that retains this ball joint in the groove, we're going to go ahead and set up my puller. All right, so with my puller set up, we're going to go ahead and start cranking it down. So here you have it, the old ball joint. We're going to go ahead and get ready to press the new one in. We have our ball joint set up, ready to go. We have the Zerk fitting installed. It's going to be pressed in from the bottom up. But before we press it in, we have to remove this rubber boot. And then you can go ahead and slip off the rubber boot. Set that aside. And we're going to go ahead and press this in now. I also added a little bit of anti-seize around this press fit surface area so it will smoothly go in and not rust. From the puller kit, I'm just going to go ahead and find the right size spacer. And I'm going to set it in here. You can see where now it's going to push up into the lower control arm hole like this. And it's going to look set up something like this originally. Once we get this ball joint started in the hole, we'll loosen it up and then we'll add this piece right here in between this C-clamp here. I'm going to start running this bolt down, and this bottom piece should push that ball joint up. So let's go ahead and do it. And that looks like it's pretty straight. And then I'm going to loosen this back up. So a couple things to consider when pressing in the ball joint to the lower control arm is just you want to make it as straight as possible. The straighter it is, the easier it's going to go in. On the lower end of the ball joint, there's a lip. That's where we're going to stop pressing it in, and the ball joint can no longer go up. The larger spacer on the top allows the top of the ball joint to be pressed through the larger spacer, so there's no binding and nothing is going to be hitting, and it allows a smooth installation. So once we're all seated and we are bottomed out with the press, we're going to go ahead and reinstall our boot. Little screwdriver, not meaning to poke it or anything, but just walk around and pushing up, you'll get it to the seal to nicely seat around the lip. All right, so we're going to take our snap ring and install it over the groove of the new ball joint, just like that. Looks good. So here's another helpful tip. When you go to install your ball joint, you want to make sure that your 90 is pointed this way or this way. If your 90 is pointed back here, you'll never be able to grease your serviceable ball joint. So now that the lower control arm ball joint has been installed, we're going to go ahead and install the upper control arm. Take our upper control arm, set it in the between frame, and add one of our bolts. Add our plates and our nuts. Okay, so we're going to line up our bolts and go ahead and start locking down the bolts where we had recently made our marks. Okay, so this part here is your sway bar end link. We're going to go ahead and take a 5/8 wrench for the top nut and a 5/8 socket wrench, preferably a deep wall. And we're going to go ahead and buzz this really long bolt off and remove the bushings. Okay, so now I can just lift up here, slide out the bushing, lower the sway bar control arm down because I have the other side unbolted as well. And then we'll go ahead and remove our long bolt. So as you've seen earlier, this is the sway bar end link right here. We're going to go ahead and install it to the lower control arm. And then we're just going to take the lower bushing here, like we have, set it up here, and then the other bushing is going to have a recess that's going to fit into the arm. So we'll slip that on, get it centered, and then take our nut right here and thread it on. Now you just want to make sure this one's loose so we can do the other side. But that's going to be how it's going to be set up and bolted to the lower control arm. And I'm just going to go ahead and cinch this hardware down until the bushings begin to squish. We just want to make sure that there's some squish in these bushings, but not enough, but not too loose to where the bushings don't seat and it becomes loose.
So you're going to want to repeat this setup for the other side.
And I think that's going to be good. Okay, so I have my nut ready to go. I'm going to grab my hub assembly and we're just going to go ahead and set it underneath this ball joint and run our nut and let the weight of the assembly rest on the nut. So now that the ball joint has been seated on the lower side, hand tight, we're going to go ahead and move the hub assembly forward towards the upper ball joint and seat the upper ball joint into the steering knuckle. Once the ball joint has been seated, go ahead and run your nut hand tight. So next, I'm going to install tie rod to the steering knuckle, like so, and I'm going to run my nut. Then I'm going to pull the hub assembly up towards my steering joint and install my inner tie rod. And with my torque wrench, I'm going to go ahead and torque this nut, which is a 7/8 nut, to 65 foot-pounds. Outer tie rod to steering knuckle, 65 foot-pounds. We're going to switch over the torque settings to a 24mm socket. And we're going to do the lower ball joint, 100 foot-pounds. Install your cotter key. And we're going to torque the upper ball joint to 68 foot-pounds. And the last two bolts we're going to torque are the upper control arm bolts to the pivot frame. So what we're going to do is torque these down to 100 foot-pounds. And there you have it. Your assembly is now totally complete. All your hardware is torqued and installed. So the last couple of things I like to do is basically just reattach my cabling. And I'll go ahead and plug that in for my ABS sensor. And I'll take some zip ties and re-zip tie that to the control arm. Like so. So the last couple of things I'll do before I put the wheel back on is I'll take some brake clean like this and spray all the grease off of the rotor. Now it's a good idea to have a piece of cardboard down on the floor to catch any debris that are falling when you're doing this job. And I'll just take some of this anti-seize. It's pretty cheap. You can find this at the auto parts store, and it's good shop practice. And I'll just put some on the little threads. You dab will do you. And don't forget, you have 7 ball joints in this kit that need grease. So just go ahead and grease each and every one. So guys, that's going to be the end of this video. We're going to wrap it up right here. I had a lot of fun doing this project, and I hope you do too. Don't forget that your front end's going to need an alignment, so you're going to have to take it to a professional alignment shop. It's going to cost you about 80 bucks. Hey, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. Helps out the channel. And also, if you have the time, go ahead and check out some of my other videos that may be helpful to you. Until next time, thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one. Peace.